2017 marks the 100th year since the birth of the late struggle icon Oliver Reginald Tambo. Tambo served as president of the ANC from 1969 to 1991, making him the longest-serving president of the party. The national centenary celebrations will be held in his home village of Nkantolo outside Bizana in the Eastern Cape tomorrow. The life of OR Tambo has been documented both in words and picture through an exhibition at the Apartheid Museum. Emilia Potenza, curator at the museum, took us through an hour-long journey through the life of OR Tambo.
So, where did it all begin? Oliver Tambo was born in Nkantolo in the Eastern Cape in a rural setting, and he herded cattle and didn't appear to be destined for greatness until he found himself at Holy Cross School. And there's a remarkable story around his early schooling. It was said that there was a bursary available for him, but when he got to the school, he found that there were no resources for him to go to school. And one of the teachers at the school had contacts with two English women in England called the Goddard sisters, Ruth and Joyce Goddard. And they were called upon to make a contribution to a bursary fund for Oliver Tambo. And they had no idea who he was, but they contributed the required funds. And years later, when he was, the ANC president in Exile, he met with Ruth and Joyce Goddard, and he said to them when he met with them that their support had not only changed his life, but had also been an act of national solidarity against apartheid. So from Holy Cross, he then goes to St. Peter's, a school in Johannesburg. And Oliver Tambo was a very bright student. And in fact, when he did his grade 10 exam in 1936, he and one other black student also at St. Peter's got the highest marks in the country. Highest marks in the country. The sad thing was that by that stage he had already lost both his parents, and so he was not able to share that extraordinary achievement with his parents. One of the things that Tambo was exposed to at a young age at both Holy Cross and St. Peter's was Christianity, and he became a devout Christian, and this was to influence his life in a very profound way. He goes from St. Peter's to Fort Hare. Now, Fort Hare was the melting pot, if you like, of all the black intellectuals in the country. It was a very important institution for training black intellectuals at the time. And here we see this amazing photograph of Tambo and his contemporaries at the time, including Walter Gumbi, Joe Mokoena, Lancelot Gama, and Congress Mbata. And unfortunately, Tambo had a crisis of conscience at Fort Hare over actually what seemed like a very small matter of a strike, and he decided that he couldn't take action without consulting his fellow students because he was a leader, and he was expelled for that situation. So he leaves Fort Hare and he comes to Johannesburg. And this photograph of Tambo in Johannesburg in the 1940s is on the roof of a building called Culvert House, which was where Ahmad Kathrada lived. And he meets a whole group of his peers in Johannesburg at that time, including Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela. Now, they then go on to form the ANC Youth League. And the ANC Youth League plays a very important role at this moment in South African history because they are much more militant than the previous generation has been, and they are saying the time for resisting in such a passive way is over, and the times call for much more militance. And one of the most exceptional leaders of the ANC Youth League, besides Tambo and Mandela and others, was Anton Lembede. Anton Lembede was a very great thinker, and he was absolutely central to the thinking of the Youth League at this time. So with a more militant Youth League formed in the country, they then have to face the implementation of apartheid in 1948. And this galvanizes them to take much stronger action, and leads to the campaigns of the 1950s, the defiance campaigns of the 1950s, during which time Tambo and Mandela set up a legal practice. Tambo realizes that the law is going to become an important weapon in the fight against apartheid. And so they open one of the first black law firms in Johannesburg. And you could imagine what it must have been like for black South Africans who are being oppressed on a daily basis by all the apartheid legislation, to feel that there are people, there are allies, there are people on their side that they can go to in times of trouble. This is an extraordinary photograph of women and children in the offices of Mandela and Tambo in the center of Johannesburg. Tambo himself says, Mandela and Tambo was written across the frosted window panes, and the letters stood out like a challenge. To white South Africa, it was bad enough that two black men should practice as lawyers, but it was indescribably worse that the letters also spelt out our political partnership. We went together into the 1952 defiance campaign, into general strikes against the government, and sat in the same treason trial dock. Now, the treason trial happened and was one of the longest trials in South African history, where those who were involved in the 1955 Congress of the People movement were charged with treason. And 156 leaders across all race groups were part of that trial. And it was during the treason trial that Tambo met Adelaide Tambo and proposed to her, and they in fact got married. And there's this wonderful photograph of their wedding. She was actually concerned that he might not make it on time to the wedding because of the treason trial, but he managed to extricate himself from the trial to get married, and this is the record of that moment. Very dramatically, Tambo was arrested and charged with treason on the day before he was supposed to get married, and he was terribly distressed, and you can imagine what Adelaide, the bride-to-be, must have been feeling on the day. But luckily they were charged and given bail, and he was able to be to present himself for his wedding on the next day, which was the 22nd of December 1956, and they were able to be married after all. The trial then went on for 4 years, and of course what happened before the end of the trial was the Sharpeville massacre. And the Sharpeville massacre changed the course of South African history and changed the course of Oliver Tambo's life, because almost all the leadership were about to be arrested, and there was the sense that to stay in the country was going to be extremely dangerous, and that somebody needed to leave the country and develop the movement in exile. And Albert Luthuli, president of the ANC at the time, instructed Tambo that he should go and set up the movement in exile. This was a terribly difficult moment for Tambo, because Tambo was on the verge of becoming a priest, a minister in the Anglican Church. He was a devout Christian, as we've already established, and this was a crossroads in his life. He had to decide whether it was going to be the church or whether it was going to be politics. And as we know, the course of his life was determined by the demands and the needs of the African National Congress. When Luthuli instructed him to leave, he took his orders from his president and went to set up the ANC in exile, and that would determine the course of the next 30 years of his life.